a lot of us have not been exposed to the details. We know that there were the turf battles. We know that the top level, what some of the issues are, but it's not until you get into some of the discussions, understand, for example, not just agency prerogatives, but the implication to the country and the agency if, for example, some of these arguments weren't waged.
We're ready.
That's why I think this is valuable.
Oh, yeah.
McNamara tried to get me fired a bunch of times
Yeah,
too
you
for
mentioned-
thwarting his will.
Yeah.
That's okay.
Didn't work, did it?
Not so. It's funny, McNamara comes up to me now, puts his arm around me, he said, God, he said, you're a hero. He said, you really saved the country's bacon. He said, you were terrific. You got all these things. I thought, you son of a bitch. Okay.
Okay, ready when you are.
You ought to edit that out, by the way. Okay. Well, look, we've been talking about the initial problems, the responsibility for the Palo Alto payload assembly area, which were contentious and dragged on much too long, and where Lockheed played a key role in keeping the program afloat while we, the government, sorted ourselves out. But that wasn't my primary focus. My primary focus at that time, in terms of my responsibilities for the Corona program, were first of all to get good people involved, and that was happening. When Crowley particularly got there, then I had infinite confidence in him. But the real question was, from my days as an analyst, using the materials from Corona, and I indicated both before I came to the government and then daily after I came to the government, it was clear to me that we were looking through an opaque glass, that we did not have the resolution that we wanted or needed, which is the more important criteria, to really confidently identify Soviet facilities, primarily Soviet, other countries a little bit. And so we needed to do better. There were a series of proposals floating around to upgrade in an incremental way Corona. The Delta launch vehicle itself was being upgraded, so there was progressively more payload. Some of that payload was being used to fly on a piggyback basis, some of the ELINT payloads, but that wasn't making the pictures any sharper. And really, I knew the people at the Photo Interpretation Center, NPIC. I knew the community users of it through my gimmick job. And there was just a sort of a level, we said, thank God we have this photography, but God, it'd be ever so much more valuable if it was just a little better. Well, that's a slippery slope. And so I said, I think we need, before we do a lot, we need to stop and really begin to understand what level do we need to go to understand, to really get the kind of yield. When do we really get over the hump? When does the confidence and the accuracy really begin to improve? We're still kind of down here on the curve. And we had something called COMOR at that time. I think it's later called COMOREX. It was a requirements committee, like the gimmick committee I had. It was a subdivision. They picked targets, but they were not in the business of trying to judge. They had no idea what they'd like in the way of better photography. It was essentially an accounting function to pick targets for first U-2s and then Corona. And so I said, I went to McCone and Carter and I said, look, I think, and I think it's fair to say that at that time the Air Force was pushing in the direction of Lanyard and Gambit, which were narrow field of view systems. It was kind of a de facto partition of work there, with Bob Greer doing, I think, a super job on getting Gambit going. But the broad area search system, the only thing we had was Corona. And Gambit was fine if you knew where to look, but if you didn't, you had to find the places to look, then Corona was it. And it needed to get better. Everyone agreed to that. The question is how much better? And once we determined that, then the question is, could you get there by a series of incremental steps, or do you have to start all over again? I felt that I couldn't figure this out for myself. And so I asked Sid Drell, a professor of physics at Stanford, the number 2 person in this linear accelerator lab there, and a person much involved in national security affairs then, and particularly since then, where he's really done a lot for this country. I asked Sid, I said, would you please get some very, very good people to come in and work almost full-time with the photo interpreters and answer two questions for me. One is, what level of resolution do we have to get to with corona or with wide area search coverage in order to really be able to find targets with confidence? And after you've figured that out, please tell me if you think that the corona system we now have can be jacked up to meet that requirement. And I said I couldn't figure it out. I wasn't sure I was smart enough, but I had a few other things. I had U-2 operations to run all the time that took presidential approval. We were responsible for all the covert overflights of U-2s. I was busy trying to get the Mach 3 airplane, the Oxcart, through flight test. I was trying to build an organization, and I just felt that this was an important enough problem and it shouldn't be swept up in the day-by-day things. And even more importantly, it shouldn't be yet another issue between Brock McMillan and myself. So we ought to get some neutral fellows that could go off and look at it. I thought it was a technical problem. I thought it lent itself to analysis and measurement, and some fair-minded people could do it. So God bless him, Drell did just this. He essentially left Stanford for a semester, quarter, and came to Washington, worked over at the Stewart Building, and brought a very talented group of people. I would encourage you to get that report because I think it's awfully important. McCone and I went to I took McCone over to hear what they had to say when they were all wrapped up. And what they had to say was that we needed to do substantially better than we were now doing to really change the situation in any measurable way, to really do what could be done with this photography. That was the answer to question number one. And to be honest, I don't remember what the numbers are, but it was like a factor of 2 or 3 improvement was required in what Corona was then delivering. And their second judgment was that the camera system that was being used then and the kind of film did not lend itself to that improvement, and therefore we had to start over. I remember walking away with McCone. He said, well, gee, so that wasn't much of a report. It wasn't very heartening, was it? I said, no, Mr. McCone. I said, now we understand where we're headed. I'll take it from here, but that was a very important input. And that then became the basis of Fulcrum. We started that very night trying to design a search system to replace Corona eventually that became Hexagon. It was called Fulcrum in the beginning. Became Hexagon and went on and did a lot of good things. But our view was that we needed to take a big step, not a series of little steps, to get to where we must be in terms of the national need. And so I put that down as one of the important stages, one of the important events during that first year of my responsibility for Corona. There was a flip side to that, and that is we didn't pour a lot more money into Corona improvements, although some took place, as you know. Lockheed came forward. I remember Gene Root came to see me, and then me and McCone, with an idea to go to what he called a 6-pack RV system, to bring the film back in 6 buckets rather than 1 or 2. We went to 2 buckets. And so there was that kind of mechanical innovation using the additional payload. We certainly stretched out the lifetime of Corona. But the basic decision had been made, and that is that that we needed to go to an entirely new camera approach. And so in essence, we, even though Corona just kept going for a long time and served this country very, very well, we saw then what the next step was. And it wasn't a warmed over Corona. And so Corona then went into a series of modest improvements and a period of relative stability and operational, very much the way the U-2 then was. I mean, it flew missions, it did its job, but it wasn't getting changed heroically while the Oxcart was coming along. Well, so then the Hexagon was to the Corona as the Oxcart was to the U-2. And so that, I think, was a singular event in at least in my understanding of what to do with Corona. The only credit I deserve in that is having asked what I think was the right question. Others gave it, and then I went out and started working on implementing the answer. But I think Drell and others, Garwin, can help you on on the ins and outs of that. I've summarized it very briefly here. There's far more to it than I've characterized, but it was an important departure. And much of my attention then after that was focused on hexagon development and trying to get the concept straight and get the R&D done, the feasibility on two other programs. One of which you want to talk about them at all?
We can. What?
My sense is you're on a real good roll here with history, and if it's.
Yeah, I don't want to pass up this opportunity.
Right.
I might have to pull out in about a half an hour or so, or an hour, and I don't want to keep you.
Well, we're almost done, I think.
Okay.
You gotta have.
Yeah, I would not pass up this opportunity. We don't want our intent, although we're not the right
I
people.
think I've told you how it began.
Yeah, no, I'm not suggesting we go in.
And I think that we could develop that further,
Right.
particularly with your involvement.
Right.
Okay, so are we on or off?
We're on.
Good. So I think I've just indicated that sort of where Corona leveled off and where the follow-on program, Broad Area Search Coverage program began, namely the program that became known as Hexagon, which was an agency initiative, and I think one of the first fruits of this model I had of vigorous patriotic competition to get the best systems up as fast as possible. But there was something else I'd learned when I was in the midst of this goddamn Cuban Missile Crisis, where we were relying on, and without stretching this matter too far to one side or the other, because of this gimmick thing, the team that we had, Army, Navy, Air Force, State, and so on, would essentially worked around the clock at the Stewart Building, analyzing the tactical, the U-2 and the tactical photography and other intelligence that came in. And then we'd prepare a report. Those have all now been released, by the way, about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. A report to the President, which McCone would take up. And more often than not, he would take me along with him in case there were questions about it. And after the intelligence had been thrown on the table with Kennedy and an advisor, then I got kicked out and I went away. But the point is that I was involved in a real-time operation that was changing very rapidly and that really mattered an awful lot. And I was impressed by the fact that Corona played no role in that entire crisis. Not very hard to figure out why. Corona goes up, it stays up, the longer the better, right? Sends back its bucket of film, it gets caught, it gets flown to Rochester, New York, it gets developed and eventually gets looked at. But the time constant is inherently weeks, months, from the time you take a picture until you actually have a print. We were after the tactical people to get those pictures back in 6-12 hours because we were looking at a situation that was evolving so rapidly. It was a crisis situation. And so Corona simply could play no role, simply because of orbit dynamics, not because it was a bad program. No satellite program could play a role. And then we had some activities that happened in the mid-60s in Eastern Europe, where situations developed very suddenly. Maneuvers turned into threatening deployments toward the Western Allies. And again, satellites weren't much help because of this doggone delay time. And I said, what we've got to do, what we must do, is find a way to bring satellite photography into the problem of current intelligence, into threat warning, into crisis management. We've got to find a way to do that. And if we're going to do that, what we have to do is drop the film return system and go to essentially a television system. I said, if I can sit in my home on Sunday afternoon in Washington and watch a football game being played in San Francisco via television, in principle we ought to be able to take that camera in San Francisco and put it up in space and watch Soviet targets, from Washington. I said, I understand it's a lot different, but I said, it isn't impossible. That, after all, was the way that Samos had begun, a little too early in the technology. But in the meantime, an awful lot of other technology had come on, and I was in close touch with the Bell Telephone Laboratories and knew of their CCD work, the thing that's now in your, perhaps in this camera, that provided the technical basis. So I said, I think what we've got to do is get started now on an almost real-time system, one which will bring photography back to the Earth at the speed of light, not the speed of orbital dynamics and KC-135s and 130s and the rest of this stuff. And I said, and I then identified Les Dirks as a very talented young guy at the agency. He later went on to, do a number of things, become DDS&T, to get the National Security Medal, but for his work. But all I did was to make Dirks available. I told him what the job was, and I said, just go do whatever it takes to get this system started. And so that again was a response to the inherent limitations of Corona, not a criticism of Corona, but a recognition of, one was to, the branch to improve Corona were twofold. One, to improve its resolution substantially. That became Hexagon. And the other was to make it a real-time system. And that became Kennen. And so out of my understanding first of the product of Corona, and then my responsibility for part of Corona, and a shared responsibility to be sure, and a contentious one, out of that really came two pretty good systems. And I don't think, I think if I'd been standing off to the side and not intimately involved in those real-time uses and episodes, I could have seen those needs. It's of some interest historically only that Bissell was at the agency. I'd invited him to come down for dinner and talk to some of the senior officers. And I told him how I saw it. I said, I think we must go to a real-time system. Dick, what do you think about that? Because I looked at him as a very senior person. He said, oh, no, Whelan. He said, that's all wrong. I said, what? He said, yep, what we got to do is make an invisible satellite. He said, one the Soviets can't track. And we'd taken the first tiny steps in stealth technology with the Oxcart, the Mach 3 airplane, as you know, with the chines, those triangular chines on the side were in fact radar reflective devices for the most part. And I said, boy, I don't know. I said, isn't it more important to get these pictures either crisper or faster than to make the satellite invisible? Well, it's the difference between being at the center of things and being off on the side. As good as Bissell was, as important a role as he played, from the sidelines, it just isn't like being in the rugby scrum. And that's why I learned a lesson from that, and that is that one, as an advisor, and God knows Washington is full of these people that come in and offer advice and leave, the weekend warriors, to always be quite humble about that. But Bissell thought I was off on the wrong track on the real-time system. He thought that what we ought to be doing was making Corona a stealthy satellite. I think maybe those are the highlights of my recollections. It's been a lot of years. It's been 30 since I was there. 29, 28 and a half. As we sit here today and the 16th, 15th, what is it today, 15th? 16th of February, 1995. It's 30 years later. What further questions do you have about this matter?
Gosh, I'll tell you, that this is so rich in information. Why don't we go back? And again, I hate doing this because it sounds like the low-pass filter approach, but considering the fact, and I think I'm about 90% confident we've got enough good, pithy statements just for this session in May. But just as a backup, let's go back remembering that we might have no more than 30, 60 seconds total. And I'm not suggesting that these are the right things to focus on for this event, but let's just go back and talk about the significance of the program from a national standpoint, maybe commenting on the importance that Eisenhower and the national community placed on the program as it was provided the first satellite photography. And then one other statement commenting on the cooperation or the teamwork between the government, amongst the government elements as well as industry. And again, I don't think those are the most significant parts of what we've been talking about, but they may play into themes that are going to be presented in May.
something that you said earlier that you spoke.
Well, I've been asked to comment on the role, the significance of the Corona photography during the early 1960s. It was a period, first of all, of incredible uncertainty about our strategic position vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. Recall that John Kennedy had run against Richard Nixon in 1960. One of his primary planks was that there was an enormous missile gap. The Soviets had strategic missiles, nuclear missiles. We did not. And something needed to be done promptly to remedy that. Prior to the summer of 1960, the issue really was quite confused, and there was room for different views on that matter. But when Corona was finally successfully recovered in 1960, mid-60, suddenly it was as if someone had turned on a great big light in the room. Suddenly we could see what was there rather than speculate or be intimidated by Russian threats. Suddenly we could see what was on the ground, and what we saw was quite remarkable. What we saw was very few satellites, very few missiles rather, very few ICBMs. In fact, far fewer than we had deployed at that time. And so the missile gap was in fact a reverse missile gap. It was the Soviets who were at the strategic disadvantage, not the United States. And that just made all the difference overnight in the posture and the self-assurance that Kennedy could adopt in dealing with Khrushchev, who was a bellicose bluffer, frankly. That's point one. Point two is that the significance of Corona photography in those early 60s. It was not all, but nearly all, the information we had about the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was a denied territory. It was a police state. It was very, very difficult to conduct clandestine operations in the Soviet Union. Because of their enormous consciousness and protection against communication security, it was very hard to listen to them. And so we were totally dependent on the Corona photography, that broad area, medium resolution, but broad area, repetitive coverage of the Soviet Union. And it was that told us where the cards were on the table. And it was that allowed each president then to deal with his Soviet counterparts knowing where the cards were and knowing what our relative position were. There was no other resource. Had Corona not been there, we would have been playing in the dark, and I think we would have been at an extraordinary disadvantage, and we might well have triggered a confrontation. And so the self-assurance, the poise, the confidence that it gave American presidents was the great gift of Corona to the West and to the American people and to American presidents.
Great.
Stunning.
Fade to black. Roll
It was
credits.
beautiful, exactly.
You guys want to ask any more zingers?
The last zingers, let's talk about the cooperation amongst government and
Oh, yes.
industry.
About the collaboration between the government agencies involved in the Corona and the industrial firms, the aerospace companies involved. In my mind, it was an extraordinary example. In fact, it was a role model for how these kinds of programs should be conducted. It was the finest hour in those early years, at least. The periods from the beginning of the Corona program until round about 63. That period was characterized by an extraordinary collaboration between the CIA and between the Air Force units that were involved. It was a productive cooperation, one in which the two parties complemented one another perfectly and cooperated perfectly for the national good, in which the interest of the institutions, the Air Force, the agency, was subordinated to the national interest, as it should be, but all too seldom is. That's part one. Part two was the confident interdependence, the confident collaboration between the principal industrial contractors, and that's Lockheed to be sure, and and ITEC, the camera maker, Eastman Kodak, the film maker, but mostly Lockheed, and this government team of CIA and the Air Force. In a way, it was a model that's very, very seldom seen. It certainly hasn't been replicated many times. It's as if we got it right the first time, and then we sort of temporarily forgot how, and have been trying to get back to that model ever since. Certainly in my time of government service, I was trying to recreate that extraordinary collaboration between government agencies, Air Force and agency, and the industrial contractors. And it's that model by which I measured my own performance and my own success.
Very good. Well, I think we got all we were looking for and quite a bit more. Excellent.
Those were heady days, let me tell
I'll
you.
tell you.
We earned I made 18.5 when I went there.
Oh, did you get that?